The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Popes Against the Modern Errors on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Matthew Gaskin, and on this episode, I'm joined by His Lordship, Bishop Donald Sanborn of Most Holy Trinity Seminary, Brooksville, Florida. Hello, my Lord. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
My Lord, I'd like to start this episode off by looking at the context in which this encyclical was written. It was written in 1891. Quick Google search has brought up for me the following incidents, some of the following incidents that happened that year. On January 31st, there was an attempt by Portuguese Republicans to have a revolution in that country, in the northern city of Porto. London and Paris were connected by telephone that year. There was an attempt made on the later Tsar Nicholas II in Japan. An assassination attempt was made. There was a union organized and strikes in Texas for cotton pickers. The first gasoline-powered car, or petrol-powered car, as we would say in this country, debuted in Springfield, Massachusetts. And Thomas Edison patented the radio. So there was a lot going on in the world, generally. There was a lot of scientific advances being made. But a lot of unrest, a lot of social unrest as well. That was the context under which this encyclical was written. Could you add anything more to that?
Yes, it's really the first time that the Church had to address something like this in its whole history, because of the Industrial Revolution, essentially. Up to about 1800, more or less. Life was the same as it was in 1800 BC. Essentially, that is, people tilled the soil. Products were made in workshops, in small workshops by hand, and people sold them in relatively small towns. But most of the people were on the land and were tilling the soil, and that was the economy of most developed nations and even undeveloped nations. So that had not changed, just as Napoleon went around Europe with the same speed and with the same kind of propulsion as Julius Caesar did, that is, with horses and wagons. And life did not really change for centuries and centuries. It was all the same. And then with the scientific developments of the late 18th century, and particularly in England and Scotland too, there grew up, and particularly in England, factories and places where things were produced by machines. And this spread to all over Europe. It spread to the United States as well. So that by even the early 19th century, people were abandoning their land and moving into cities to work for these big factories. And this just changed the whole way in which people lived and did business. And it created a very significant class difference. The one was that of the super rich entrepreneur who owned a factory, let's say in Manchester, England, which was a center for fabrics and cloth. Enormously rich, just incredibly rich. And then tenements of people living in squalor that had come in from the farms. In Manchester, many had come in from Ireland to work in these factories under deplorable conditions. And this was, again, multiplying itself all over Europe and all over the United States. So the northeastern part of the United States had the same problem. So that was unheard of in the history of the world. And it was the result of the Industrial Revolution. And as I said, it was felt most keenly in England. So because the conditions of the workers were so squalid and because the entrepreneurs were so selfish, there was developing a class warfare. And the answer to this class problem was, in most of Europe, socialism. So, for example, the Communist Manifesto was published by Marx and Engels in 1848. By the way, both of them lived in Manchester. So
yes, they did.
That was considered the home of the Industrial Revolution, and
England is nothing if not liberal. So they'll let anybody stay here. It doesn't matter who you are.
Yes. So they were very active in that city, and but it's very very much an example of the whole world. And Manchester is very much because it attracted so many people, including people from Ireland and a lot of Catholics too. So that was 1848, and that was the beginning of a consciousness of what to do about this. And so the church felt the need to, on the one hand, say something about the moral theology of worker versus entrepreneur, and at the same time to condemn socialism, which was a very, very evil doctrine. And that is why Leo XIII is saying this, because socialism is heavily on the rise by the latter part of the 19th century. Every single European country is dealing with the problems of socialism and class warfare. Germany, England, France, the whole of Europe, and the United States too. Labor unions in the United States, strikes, especially the northeastern industrial area of the United States, is feeling it. The United States, however, remained very much an agrarian country until World War II, really. It was a farm country, and it is to a great extent today, but the farms are in the hands of tremendous entrepreneurs who own enormous pieces of land and run it like a big business. But that's aside. But up to about World War II, the United States, it was a very agrarian society. As a matter of fact, the bishops chose St. Isidore the Farmer as one of the patrons of the United States because there were so many farmers in the United States. So we were lagging a little bit in this whole thing. But it caused a tremendous social change in England, too. So that was on the rise, socialism. And the church wanted to put a stop to socialism, but also lecture everybody on what the relationship should be between worker and entrepreneur. So that's the context of this. So it's a very strong condemnation of socialism, this encyclical. But at the same time, it's not siding with laissez-faire liberal capitalism, where the worker is considered just a dog, essentially, that is there to work for the lowest possible price that he can fetch. It is condemning all of that at the same time. So that's the context. Now, socialism will just explode after World War I everywhere. It will explode in England. It had been exploding in England up to that time. The decade or so before it, it was becoming very, very prevalent in England. But all Europe, the reason why, for example, the Germans ceased to fight was primarily because the socialists ate out, we might say, or corrupted the spirit of the army so that they wouldn't fight. The Germans, I believe, if they had continued to fight, probably would have prevailed. But there was a revolt, a socialist revolt against the Kaiser. And he had no more army to send in. That was why, was one of the principal reasons why they sought the armistice. And of course, the Bolshevists in Russia, it was a disease that just went everywhere. And we're still laboring under the socialist problem. Here, 100 years after 98 years after the Russian Revolution, we are all socialists. I mean, all of our governments are socialist to a greater or lesser extent, probably less so in the United States. But nonetheless, there's plenty of socialism over here. Our president is a declared socialist. And, of course, we know Europe is very much in the grips of socialism as well. So it is something that essentially took over the Western world. So that's why this encyclical is here. And that's why it's very topical today, because it addresses the very economic system and governmental system that we're all living in and under today.
Yes. Well, she certainly wasn't a Catholic, but as the late Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you run out of everybody else's money.
Another one was the definition of socialism is that you're generous with other people's money.
Yeah. The first paragraph is all about the spirit of revolutionary change at that time. And if we look at the world today, whether you read the mainstream media or the alternative media or whatever newspaper really you pick up or wherever you get your news from, you can't ignore the fact that in the past decade, a financial crisis, there's a widespread acknowledgement of a widening gap between rich and poor. There's deindustrialization in Western countries. There seems to be, and this is my opinion, it's not necessarily the opinion of the Restoration Radio Network, but it's my opinion that we have a rapacious banking system. We have states run by self-serving politicians and a judiciary, and this is undeniable, particularly in light of what happened in the United States recently, a judiciary that is intent on legalizing immorality. And Leo XIII addresses all of these issues in the encyclical. It's really a tour de force of philosophy and theology and applied to the lot of man. Could you speak a bit more about Leo XIII? Was he a Thomist? He quotes St. Thomas a lot.
Yes, he was an excellent Thomist, a very intelligent man. He was practically single-handedly responsible for the making Thomism the common philosophy of the church. Thomism had been very, very popular, we might say, up to about 1400. Then it fell into, we'll call it an unpopularity, except with the Dominicans. The Dominicans held on to Thomism, but it was essentially the property of the Dominicans, and the Jesuits had their Suarez, and Suarez became very popular because he was a Jesuit, and there were a gazillion Jesuits, and they were in charge of the schools, and they had a lot of money, and so they became the big order. And so Suarez outshined St. Thomas for a long time, although the Dominicans always, were very faithful to St. Thomas. And then, in the 18th century, the Catholic schools, even seminaries, started to teach Descartes and all sorts of other odd philosophies and very dangerous philosophies and false philosophies, and tried to explain dogmas with Descartes' philosophy, which is impossible. But so theology was in bad condition by the end of the 18th century. It did not improve significantly during the 19th century. There were some decent theologians, but it was, in comparison to the Middle Ages, it was in bad condition. And believe it or not, the push to make Thomism the philosophy of the Catholic Church came from the Jesuits. It came from two Jesuits. Yes, it came from the Jesuits. It came from Liberatore and Tongiorgi, two Jesuits in Italy who pushed for the establishment of Thomism as the Catholic philosophy. And they were active when Leo XIII was a priest and a bishop, mid-19th century. So he very much was in favor of that. And one of the first things he did, one of his first encyclicals, was to establish Thomism as the church's philosophy and to re-edit the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. And he gave a tremendous impetus to the revival of Thomism. And then you saw great people like Garrigou-Lagrange, Cardinal Billot, many other great theologians who were Thomists and who represented Thomism to the whole world in books that were a little easier to understand than St. Thomas himself and more condensed, and also commented on a lot of the things that St. Thomas said in relation to the modern problems and things that St. Thomas had never thought of. So there was an upsurge in the church's theology from the time of 1878 until the council. I mean, it was going great guns, and it would have continued if the council had not put an arrow in its heart with modern philosophy and Kantianism and all sorts of other nonsense and garbage. That was Leo XIII's great contribution, and yes, he does quote St. Thomas. And this this encyclical is a course in Catholic philosophy of economics and concerning private property. I mean, when I read it, it's like reading a textbook. I mean, he was certainly familiar with these things and wanted to present them in an organized way.
Yes. We're not going to talk about the Chestertonian idea and Belloc's idea of distributism. We're not going to talk about money creation or anything like that. For people who want to research those sort of subjects, you can go away and look at that. We're going to look at the encyclical. So we've gone through the idea that this was a time of revolutionary change, and he has to, in the encyclical, define some rights. He has to define the rights of employers and the rights of labourers. And he says that this is not an easy thing to do because, and to quote him, he says, crafty agitators are intent on making use of these differences, the differences between labourers and employers, to pervert men's judgments and to stir up the people to revolt. Now, in that, is he directly addressing the problem of socialism in Europe at the time?
Absolutely. That is a blow against the Marxists, who see as the remedy for the evils of, let's say, laissez-faire capitalism, or what we might call liberal capitalism. That is, do whatever you want. It's a free field. Pay your workers the least possible, just as if they were slaves. Fire them at will, and have no care about their personal welfare, and just let the free market reign, and it'll seek its own course, and whatever course it seeks is the right one. That is laissez-faire or liberal capitalism, and that naturally caused real problems. The socialists were not wrong in noticing the problems. There were very, very real problems, and there were children working in factories. The conditions of the factories were very bad in New York City. There were many young women who died in a factory, I think, in the 1880s or so, because there were no exits. A fire occurred, and nobody could get out. They were all burned to death. They were jumping out of the windows. Because the employer didn't really care. Just use them. They're like animals, and they come in. They're like slaves practically. As a matter of fact, at the time of the U.S. Civil War, around 1859, there was a Southern writer who said, addressing the Northerners, "You have your slaves up there. They work in your factories. You pay them so little that their condition is really no different from the condition of our slaves." And he was absolutely right. And so, I mean, the socialists were not wrong to notice the problem, but their solution was all wrong, and that was that there should be a state control of the means of production, and that the worker should rise up against the employer and should see him as an enemy, see him as somebody that does not deserve to have what he has, and cause a class struggle. So Europe was beset by that. I mean, it was there were strikes all over England, particularly. A lot of agitation with regard to that was fomented by socialists, and it caused a tremendous problem. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. For 70 years, those people labored under a socialist regime. Look at even communist China today. I mean, once that gets a hold of a society where the state becomes the all-powerful, essentially, employer, which is socialism in its most extreme form, which is communism, where the state is the employer. You get your check from the state, whether you're making shoes or whether you're making rockets for outer space. Your paycheck comes from the state. That is communism. Socialism is a more moderate form of that, but socialism requires the state to get involved in the lives of the individuals and to either limit or deny. In the case of communism, deny, but in socialism, limit the rights of private property. So that was the problem. That the problem was there. The solution of the socialists was wrong. And so Leo XIII is saying, essentially in this encyclical, the problems are real, but your solution is wrong, and this is the solution. The Catholic solution is the right one. So that's what he's trying to explain here.
In the third paragraph, he talks about the fact that the guilds are gone. Of course, there's appalling monopolistic guilds that allow people to make unreasonable profits. There was an awful system, wasn't it, in medieval Europe? The very we'll just address that very quickly and skip over it. The very idea that is true is ridiculous, because all of these communities were small communities. If the blacksmiths were all living in mansions, and the tanners were living in and the bakers were living in hovels, then clearly there would be some kind of agreement made that the blacksmiths were charging too much. But of course, that was all stripped away. And done away with, the accused of being monopolistic. And Leo XIII points out that actually the greed of unchecked competition is what's left. And yes, certainly in northern England, which was really the heartland of the Industrial Revolution in England, those northern towns like Manchester, Blackburn, Bolton, Lancaster, Halifax, Leeds, Sheffield, York, Doncaster, they were the real engines of growth. And there were mills up in Yorkshire, Lancashire, where the mill owners would provide decent accommodation and were generally beneficent to their employees, and they would provide them with decent sanitation, decent housing. But they were few and far between. Most of the people crowded in from the land. They crowded in from agricultural occupations, and you're absolutely right. They lived in hovels. But then Leo XIII goes on. He talks about the socialist solution, which is essentially to exploit the poor's envy of the rich. But essentially, socialism, the three things he says about it is it robs the lawful possessor of his possessions, it distorts the functions of the state, and it creates utter confusion in the community. And he then goes on to say that the aim of labor is to obtain property. Now, all of our listeners should know that the holding of private property is perfectly Catholic. Why is the holding of private property perfectly in accordance with Catholic doctrine?
Well, because in order to function, we have to have use and permanent use of certain things. We have to have permanent use of shelter, permanent use of clothing, transportation, permanent use of legitimate luxuries. If we get beyond the survival stage, that this pertains to man's good, and that he cannot live a normal life if he does not have permanent use of those things. And that permanent use is his private property. Also, by the very nature of what he does to obtain those things, he has private property because, as Leo XIII says in this encyclical, he implants upon, whether it is the soil or it could be some other work, his own what he makes or what he does. He implants his own personality. If you till the soil, for example, on that field, you are placing some of yourself. And those plants are there, and the fruits of those plants are there because of what you have done. They have proceeded in that way from you. And had you not tilled that soil, they would not be there. It would be a field of weeds. So, therefore, because these fruits come out of you, they should belong to you because they're part of you. It's almost as if they're your own children in a way. So he makes that point very, very carefully. But that by the very nature of what you do, you have a right to private property, and also it is impossible for human beings to lead their lives well, and even it's impossible. It would be human life would be impossible unless there were private property. An example of that is if he, in the apartment house, or excuse me, I don't know what you call that in England, the flat house. What do you call it?
Oh yeah, well yeah, you could call it an apartment. We would know what you mean, but you would probably say a flat.
If at the end of the hallway there were a common vacuum cleaner, just so that no one could own his own vacuum cleaner, but there was a common vacuum cleaner at the end of the hallway, I would give that about 1 month before it became unusable because of the way people would treat it.
Yeah.
And therefore, in a socialist society, you would not be able to vacuum your rug because it would fall into the terrible disorder, or it would be stolen. That's one example of why human beings all need to have and own their own vacuum cleaners. Life would become impossible if we did not have permanent use and exclusive use of certain things that pertain to our perfection in life. And a vacuum cleaner is one of those things, or a car, or anything else that is necessary for life. We have to be able to have permanent use of those things, and that's essentially what private property is. So Leo XIII goes on for quite a few paragraphs explaining essentially that, and condemns socialism for its denial of private property, because that is at the heart of socialism. It has many definitions, socialism. It has many descriptions. Many people wrote many books on socialism, and very good books. But at the heart of socialism is the question of private property. The extreme form of socialism is communism. It denies private property entirely. The moderated forms of socialism admit private property to a certain extent, but involve the state in how you use it and what you can do with it. So there are laws concerning inheritance and laws concerning taxes and various other. I don't have to tell you, living in a very socialistic country like England, how much the state has gotten into your life. Going back to those guilds, just as the people may not understand the guilds, and it's actually an important point, because the guilds were these associations, and they were religious associations, which on the one hand protected the life of the worker, and in this case the craftsman in the town, and on the other hand made sure that he behaved himself. So it was based on this principle that all economic life must be governed. See, the problem of the 19th century is that liberalism got into the idea of economics. It infected economics just as it infected politics and infected religion and infected everything. That is, we should have no constraints upon ourselves except those that may harm someone else. So the idea was that economics should be free. You should be able to do whatever you please. The law of economics is simply to get ahead. So, for example, in this country, what in the United States, what is typical is that what we call a big box comes in. I don't know if you know that. It's one of these tremendous, like Walmart, or I don't know if you have those in England, but we
have just under a different name, but yeah.
They have tremendous entrepreneurs behind them. They come in and undersell everybody. They undersell, for example, anybody that's selling anything in his little shop. And so all of the little shops dry up, and then the big box takes over. So, and then they raise the prices typically after they have driven everyone out of competition, and that's very typical. The guilds prevented that. If you were the shoemaker in the little town, you were the only shoemaker, unless it was necessary to have two shoemakers. But it would govern the life of the town, the economic life of the town, in a very benevolent way, and it protected everybody. And that's a point that must be made: is that economics, just like anything else that human beings do, must be governed. You can't just you can't let anything run amok. You can't let anything run wild and find its own way. It's going to crash if you do that. And that's exactly what happened in the 19th century. And so the socialists are looking for government of economics, but they are looking for it in the wrong way. So I just wanted to go back to the guilds. That's why Leo XIII laments the passing of the guilds, which were dissolved by the French Revolution. Laments that, and really is giving all of the rationale of the guilds in this encyclical. The French Revolution was very much a revolution of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, that did not want the constraints of the old medieval aristocracy versus serf mentality. And it is true that something had to be done to adjust society to the existence of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the entrepreneurial class. It is true. I mean, even France was living in a world that was not real, because they were considered to be part of the peasant world that tilled the soil. But they're instead of coming up with an equitable solution to that problem, they revolted. And they were the winners in the French Revolution, and they wanted that economic liberalism that made the entrepreneur practically a king in the economic order. I just wanted to cover that.
That's certainly a very good thing to cover, particularly with regards to the bourgeoisie wanting to liberalize economics. I studied actually neoliberal economics at university. I spent 3 years scratching my head thinking there's something not right about all these things I'm being taught, but I can't figure out what it is because I'm not particularly bright. It took me quite a long time to cotton on. But when I left university and started doing a bit more reading, I realized what the problems were. And it benefits the bourgeoisie enormously to liberalize economics because the largest proportion of the population are economically illiterate. They can't tell you how money is created. They can't tell you what the relationship is between a bond's interest rate and the price paid for it. They don't know. They don't understand why or how this system works. A lot of it is deliberately obfuscated to make it look a lot more complicated than it really is. Mm-hmm. But that's certainly the case. And so it makes perfect sense why the French bourgeoisie would want to, in line with liberalizing politics and morality, would also want to go and liberalize economics as well, because they could become fabulously wealthy from it. The Pope goes on to say that it's the rationality, we've already really discussed this, but it's the rationality of man that demands private property. It's a rationality that separates man from the animals. And he then goes on to say that, as you have already said, we've covered this as well, but all human subsistence derives from the land. again, as you pointed out, man works the land. We can go back to Genesis. So in Genesis, Genesis states after the fall, "Cursed is the earth in thy work, with labour and toil shalt thou eat thereof all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herbs of the earth. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread." So this socialists assume that you give a load of land to somebody and suddenly they become fabulously wealthy and have to do absolutely nothing for it. Well, that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. No, the socialists would be for state ownership of all the land, essentially the collective farm. And it would hire workers to work the land, and the state would collect all of those fruits of the land, and then you would get some of it back and some sort of money for it. That's the socialist solution to that, but that's not the Catholic solution. Each man ideally should have work his own land and benefit from the fruits of his own land. And the same would be true, if he's working in his own shop or if he's working in a factory. He'll say later in this encyclical that it would be good for the let's say factory workers or entrepreneurs to let their employees profit or participate in the profits of what they make. See, that they should not only receive a wage, but also that if the company does well, they get a check for participation in the profits. It's the same principle that they have put their personality upon what they make, and therefore they should receive something back for it. That they're not merely slaves living on subsistence, but that they should participate in the fruits of the earth and in the fruits of the factory. That's the ideal Catholic position, that they should have some benefit from what they produce.
Yes. He then goes on to point out that private ownership, we've already established that private ownership is perfectly in accordance with the natural law and is, at least at the moment, backed up by civil law. But the Pope points out that this is all capped by divine law. It's particularly in the Ten Commandments: "Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's goods." So if private ownership wasn't a part of Catholic doctrine, that it would be a nonsense.
So you would have to eliminate the 10th commandment.
Absolutely. He then starts going down a route of talking about the family, and he's talking about the fact that man may marry, and as marriage and the right to marry and the family precede the state, the rights and duties of the family are quite independent of the state within certain limits. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the fundamental society is the family, and it depends on natural law. That is, it comes from matrimony, which is all natural law. Children are naturally belong to their parents, so the family is something established by God. The state is an outgrowth of the family, and therefore the rights of the family are prior to the rights of the state. And here he's saying that whatever pertains to private property with regard to the individual pertains more to the family, that it is impossible to raise a family correctly unless there is the guarantee of private property. So now that he does make a case for the state intervening if a drunken father is beating up his wife and his children, he doesn't give that example, but I think that's what he means. The state has to intervene there and take the father out of the family and or the children away from him and somehow solve that problem. So they occasionally and in extreme cases, the state has to intervene. But the state should not be, as he says in this encyclical, reaching into the family and replacing the father and replacing the parents, as has happened terribly in modern society. which is the effect of liberalism. Liberalism sees in the liberal state everyone's equal, and the state consists of a mass of equals, like a big bag of marbles. Everyone is equal, whether it is, your profession is to be a prostitute or your profession is to be a priest. Everyone's equal. We're all in it together. And so the state does not see anything between itself and the individual, and therefore reaches down into the children, reaches beyond the church, beyond the mother, the father, all of the God-given society, and goes right to the children and dictates where they should go to school, what they should learn in school, whether they should have vaccination, various other things that really are the domain of the parents. And he is complaining about that in the socialistic state in this encyclical, that the rights of the father and the family have to be observed.
And Leo XIII replies to this idea straight back with the idea that, and I quote, "the domestic household is antecedent as well in idea as in fact to the gathering of men into a community. The family must necessarily have rights and duties which are prior to those of the community." So he destroys that argument. It seems that whether it's in mildly socialist governments verging all around to the really heavy communist, it seems that the state wants to intrude into every aspect of people's lives.
Yes, it sees nothing between itself and the individual. That's the effect of liberalism. It's the effect of the French Revolution. We're all equal. We're all citizens, so everyone was called citizen this and citizen that. Comrade in Soviet Russia. Yeah. Comrade Stalin, who was a little bit more equal than everybody else. And that's very typical of socialism, and that is why there's so much invasion of the family by socialism. And just let me read this great quotation from the encyclical. He says, "Paternal authority can be neither abolished nor absorbed by the state, for it has the same source as human life itself. Quote, the child belongs to the father, unquote, and is, as it were, the continuation of the father's personality. And speaking strictly, the child takes its place in civil society not of its own right, but in its quality as member of the family in which it is born." See, very important. See, as member of the family in which it is born. "And for the very reason that, quote, the child belongs to the father, unquote, it is, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, quote, before it attains the use of free will, under the power and the charge of its parents, unquote. The socialists, therefore," Leo continues, "in setting aside the parent and setting up a state supervision, act against natural justice and destroy the structure of the home." That's a great quotation. It says everything. And by the way, this is a footnote to what we're talking about, but part of the rise of socialism was also the rise of women's right to vote. That was, again, England was the place for that. And in the early late 19th, early 20th century, and there were a lot of demonstrations for that. The reason for that, for why women were not permitted to vote in any society, even though they were not permitted to vote even in ancient Greece, in Athens, is because the father voted for the whole family. It respected the family unit. Just as the child, as he says, the child takes its place in civil society, not of its own right, but in its quality as member of the family in which it is born. So the father is the head of this one body of the family, so to speak. He casts the vote because the family is the unit of society and not the individual. And, that is somewhat analogically respected by, believe it or not, the electoral system in this country. If you in the United States, the president is elected by a board of electors. And they are elected in each state. So that's why each state throws all of its votes to one or the other. It is not by popular vote. It is by electoral vote. So the whole state will go for one candidate or the other, which is, I know in Europe, people just marvel at that and want to gasp at it. They don't understand it. But it's because in this republic, the unit that makes up the republic, at least in principle, is the state. And it is not the individual. The individual does not belong to Washington. The state does, or the state has a relationship to Washington, to the capital. So it is governed. The government, the federal government, it concerns the states, not individuals. That's analogical to the society. That the father casts the vote for the whole family. That's why women did not have the right to vote, because there was a great, traditionally, a great respect for paternal authority, which of course broke up with liberalism and socialism. So it's not surprising that the suffragettes and all of those people were very allied to leftists and socialist movements.
It's funny you should say that. I just remembered that in Ecuador, Garcia Moreno, the former president of Ecuador, before he was assassinated, he enacted a law in which, when it came down to referendums, only fathers of families could vote. If you were a single man, you would not be allowed to vote because you were not the head of a family, and therefore you didn't have to look at your children and look after your children and make decisions that were conducive to your children's future welfare. So it was only the heads of families who could vote, and he was a Catholic president. He obviously understood the principles behind it, and of course he was assassinated.
Yes, Leo XIII, by the way, said, as he looks around the whole world, it is only little Ecuador which is a rightly governed society.
Yeah, well,
he made that statement, but that came to an end. So, that's the reason for the movement. The suffragette movement was very much tied to socialism. Yes. Everyone's equal. So now the father can be the Democrat, the mother the Republican, and vice versa. The children can all vote for whomever they please, because it is just, as I said, a big bag of marbles, and there is no, everybody's equal, and it doesn't matter. So, but in this country too, again, everybody touts democracy. In this country, you had to be a landowner in order to vote in this country in the 18th century. So
really?
A lot of people were, you had to have a certain amount of land. I forget how many acres you had to have in order to qualify to vote. So this was not what you call a democratic country in its origin. It was in other words, you had to be somebody. You had to be somebody who was responsible and worked for a living, and at that time there were no factories to speak of. So if you didn't own land, you were not considered to be in that class of people.
But I thought the United States was a classless society.
Well, it has plenty of class. Well, it's not a class. It's a class, a very much aristocratic society, but of money.
Yes.
There's what it has nothing to do with titles, but there's plenty of aristocracy of money. And people like Donald Trump and all. I mean, that's like the Duke of whatever. He has all of the prestige of what a British aristocrat of the 18th century, because he's got money, and he could have got or Bill Gates, the same thing. I mean, they live like aristocrats. They have power like aristocrats in their own way. So there is definitely society can never be without class. It is impossible to not have to do away with class in a society. But yes, that was the idea in the 18th century framers of the Constitution, that there would be no titles. That's why in this country I'm Your Excellency, whereas in your country I'm Your Lordship. Sounds pretty good when I go over there. I kind of like it.
Yeah, we need to make progress with Sir Anthony, though. That's a problem. Okay, in fact, I have to interview him soon, so I'll bring it up and see what he says.
Oh, he'll say just go right ahead. I'm sure he'll like that.
I'm sure he will. But that idea that under socialism everything has to be equal, that moves us along quite nicely to the next paragraph, actually, in which the Pope basically says that socialism brings everything low. When you try to equalize a society, you very rarely are able to pull everybody up. It's a lot easier to just push everybody down. There's a famous saying from the old Soviet Union. The workers used to say, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And the idea was essentially that actually they didn't own anything. So they didn't put any effort into working the soil, really working the land, making things of any reasonable quality. There was no real effort or excellence in anything, and everything you saw coming out of the USSR. The cars were terrible, and I mean, pretty much everything they had was awful. Yes. Because they had no incentive to work. They didn't want to do anything. So socialism impoverishes everybody rather than having this sort of employees' paradise.
Yes, I always say that. Go and visit Eastern Europe and Russia, and look at the 70 years of what socialism did. And in Eastern Europe, it was only about 40 years. What socialism did to people and how it reduced them. You see, for example, in Hungary, how much in the capital in Budapest, the wealth that there was in the late 19th century. Beautiful buildings, architecture, all of those things were put up in the late 19th century. Then you see what happened. These horrid buildings that you wouldn't put animals in. I mean, just cheap things thrown together that people would live in, and you can see the imprint of socialism upon that country, and more so in Russia. The same thing in Russia. I saw it in Poland too. So, but as we know, many socialists are BMW socialists. They live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan Island, and they drive around in magnificent cars, and they're socialists because it clears their conscience. See, as they drive around in their $100,000 car or whatever they have, or better, and they're helping the poor. You see, because they're socialists, as they buy their $20 million flats in the Upper East Side and so forth. That's there's so much hypocrisy there. It just amuses me that they're socialists. Everyone in New York City is a socialist. I don't know if you know that. Yes, I mean, you can cut it with a knife. If you're not a socialist, it's practically a religion in New York City. And the richer you are, the more socialistic you are. Yes. Oh. And it's a supreme hypocrisy because they would no longer. The idea of giving away your money to the poor would be something absolutely horrifying to them. They may not be able to make their payments on the BMW. So, but that's what social. It just amuses me that they have never gone and looked at socialism in the face in Eastern Europe. But there they are in Manhattan. But Leo has another great quote that I'll read. He says, this is in paragraph 15. Hence, it is clear that the main tenet of socialism, community of goods, must be utterly rejected. Notice how he says that. Since it only injures those whom it would seem meant to benefit, is directly contrary to the natural rights of mankind, and would introduce confusion and disorder into the common weal. Beautiful quote. Absolutely to be rejected, utterly rejected. So So, and then in the next sentence, he says, an absolute condition of the bettering of the masses is the inviolability of private property. So the church is absolutely clear on this point and is absolutely anti-socialist. Now,
Yes.
this will change under John the 23rd and Paul VI as everything else changed. Paul VI was certainly a socialist. We don't have time to talk about him, but all of that will change.
Now, I wonder if anybody's told Bergoglio, because Leo XIII, in the second sentence of paragraph 16, makes it very clear. It is we who are the chief guardian of religion and the chief dispenser of what pertains to the church. He then goes on in the same paragraph to say that all the striving of men will be in vain if they leave out the church, because the ultimate end of society is virtue.
Yes. Yeah, so this gets into Gaudium et Spes. I talked about this in another show, that the church all up to, and I say the church, I mean this loosely because I don't consider John the 23rd the church nor Paul VI, but they have an aspect of being the church. The church always insisted that you cannot perfect man without the Redeemer. That there's no utopian society of socialist solutions or any other kind of human solution. It's impossible to perfect the earth and bring it to peace without the Redeemer and obviously without the church. That was all changed with Vatican II. Pius IX condemned the modern world and the syllabus and all of the socialism, communism, and all of the tendencies of the modern world. Gaudium et Spes, which Ratzinger called the anti-syllabus, hooked up the Catholic Church to the idea of perfecting man without the Redeemer. So Paul VI in 1965 goes to the UN and says, "You're the last hope of mankind." And goes on and on. I mean, you can listen to our show that I did with Stephen Heiner. Or it goes on and on and on about how the church is with you now, and we're, with you, we're going to perfect humanity and bring it to a state of peace and prosperity and everything else. So that's a very important point that Leo makes here, is that there's no hope for this race without the Redeemer and without the church.
So the next point, the paragraph 17, this is going to be a bit like lighting a firework. I'm going to stand back here and watch it go off. He talks about the equality of people, and me lighting the firework is simply asking you, my lord, are people equal?
Well, in a certain sense they are, and in a certain sense they're not. Everyone is equal in as much as he or she has the human nature. So if you're just isolating human nature, we are all equal as human beings. But obviously, there are other accidents that pertain to human nature, and that's where we are very unequal. Many people differ according to intelligence, according to skill, strength, many other what we call accidents, qualities that pertain to them. And some people are better than others. Some people are far more talented than others in all ways. This difference is very good for society because there has to be the entrepreneur who is courageous and who's intelligent, and there has to be the worker who is perhaps less intelligent and less courageous. They both need each other because the worker would starve to death unless he were hired. The entrepreneur could not make his great factory or develop his business unless there are workers who are willing to do menial jobs or medium jobs, let's say, either way. I mean, menial or in the middle. There has to be a number one, there has to be a number 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, etc. All businesses, all governments are set up that way. All machines are set up that way. There has to be a division of labor, and there has to be there is a hierarchy of what you do. A vice president of a major corporation is far more valuable than somebody who sweeps the floor of the factory. Just like your brain is more valuable than your big toe. So it's everything has a hierarchy of quality and also a hierarchy of function based on those qualities. That is true of all of creation, just as the lion and the gazelle and the hunter is usually a higher form of life than the hunted, and has more qualities than what is hunted. And God made it that way. There is a balance and an order in all of those things. Just as the coal, the piece of coal is quite different from the diamond, even though in nature they're absolutely the same. Offer your fiancé a big lump of coal on sitting on a ring and see what happens. And say, well, it's all the same.
It's all the same carbon.
Yes.
Moving on to paragraph 18. Leo says...
Just let me, there's a great quote in 17. Socialists may, in that intent, do their utmost, but all striving against nature is in vain. I love that, too. All striving against nature is in vain. And it's very topical to what the Supreme Court just did in this country and approving homosexual marriages. All striving against nature is in vain, and that will be told with time in this country. There's a lot of excitement about it now, but that unnatural activity will never gain true acceptance among people. It will always be considered weird. So that's let's go on to 18.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's move on. The gender inequality, he's discussed the gender inequality, but he then points out, and really, again, somebody should point this out to Mr. B at the moment. He says, quote, "To suffer and to endure, therefore, is the lot of humanity. Let them strive as they may, no strength and no artifice will ever succeed in banishing from human life the ills and troubles which beset it," unquote.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's the ills and troubles that beset human life are the result of original sin. First of all, as you quoted Genesis before, the earth was enlisted to help in the punishment of man. And so as soon as he's born, he's got trouble. He's got to till that soil, which, do you ever notice that weeds come up very nicely and stay there, and whereas the flowers don't do so well and are overcome by the weeds? Why can't it be the opposite? Why can't we have the flowers that are more hardy than the weeds and vice versa? But no, they are there because the earth was enlisted in the punishment of man, and the natural disasters that take place are part of the general punishment of man. We should not think from that because a city has an earthquake, that therefore all of those people are the most evil people in the world. Not at all. Or that a tornado rips through a town, that those are all evil people that were particularly punished by God. No, however, the general difficulty in living upon this earth is something intended by God for the general punishment of human beings. We have a hard time with it. I mean, as I often point out in sermons, that there are people who get up in the morning, especially in this country, who are fine, and by the end of the day, they are dead because of a tornado.
Yes. Because
the weather changed. And they did not expect to be dead by the end of the day. But they had the misfortune of being in their house and did not pay attention to the weather report and so forth. That is just part of human life as a result of original sin. And also, what is far worse than that, man drags into his daily life the effects of original sin, such as selfishness and pride. That is what caused all of the troubles that led to liberalism, liberal capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, and its counterpart socialism, is pride and envy. That's part of original sin. You are never going to wipe out the effects of original sin. You can control them by virtue, but they will always be there, ready to take over if you if you do not constantly repress them by mortification. And that's where the church comes in, is that it is preaching virtue. It is giving you the means of virtue by the Holy Sacraments, by its general preaching, and by mortification, the call to mortification. Things like this encyclical, explaining to people what they should and should not do. But the socialist would like to see a world without God, without the church, and a world that he can perfect by the writings of Engels and Marx, essentially. Wonderful prophets of the human race.
Have you got any quotations from that paragraph you'd like to read out, or should we move on to the next?
Well, I'm looking in paragraph 19. Maybe I'm jumping
that's fine.
Paragraph 18. In like manner, the other pains and hardships of life will have no end or cessation on earth, because the consequences of sin are bitter and hard to bear. That's paragraph 18, what we just said. Yeah. And he develops that in that. And then paragraph 19, he gets into the fact that there should be harmony between the entrepreneur and the worker, not disagreement and not strife and not opposition. And again, he comes up with a magnificent quotation. Each, meaning the entrepreneur and the worker, needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. Very important quotation. Mutual agreement, he says, results in the beauty of good order, while perpetual conflict necessarily produces confusion and savage barbarity. Absolutely true, and we've seen that lived out in the 20th century. And in our own century, yes, very much.
In the next paragraph, in paragraph 20, he goes on to talk about these mutual duties. And it's mainly the employer's responsibilities towards his employee.
Most of it is, yes. He gives some of the other, employee to employer, but mostly it's employer to employee. It reads like a moral theology book. He spells it all out. Essentially, he tells the employee to not be opposed to his employer, to perform his work well, and to agree to a price and not to complain about it, never to injure the property nor outrage the person of an employer, never to resort to violence or engage in riot or disorder. So all these things are condemned. So this condemns most of the activities of labor unions. He does not condemn labor unions in themselves or the idea of associations of workers. The Catholic Church actually promoted that, particularly in Germany under Bishop Kettler of Mainz. There were Catholic organizations of workers, somewhat replacing the guilds in the middle 19th century, but they gave way to the labor unions eventually. But labor unions often use these tactics that Leo XIII condemns here. But he turns to the employer and says, don't look upon their work people as their bondsmen, but to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled by Christian character. Notice that it's not merely dignity as a person, but ennobled by Christian character. He says, working for gain is creditable, not shameful to a man. So it's not bad to be a worker, a factory worker, a man who sweeps the floor. It enables him to earn an honorable livelihood. But to misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain, or to value them solely for their physical powers, that is truly shameful and inhuman. So he really gives it to these cold entrepreneurs. And there were plenty of them at the time. I remember somebody telling me that out in Butte, a place called Butte, Montana, in the western part of the United States, there's a tremendous copper mine. I think it's shut down now, but everybody worked in the copper mine. And it was owned by one person. This was in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And if you so much as asked for a day off to go to your mother's funeral, you would be fired. They just considered you to be dirt, and they had absolutely no mercy. If you were sick, you'd get fired. If you didn't show up for work, you'd get fired because you were just like a part in the machine. If you didn't do your work, you were thrown out. He is blasting people like that in that sentence. And they deserve to be blasted. That was the very problem, and that was the fuel of socialism and the fuel of all of the socialistic and violent means that labor unions were using at the time. Yes, he goes on and on about what the duties of the employer and how the workers should not be in any way abused. Very edifying and becoming to the church that it is always looking toward the lower class, in the sense of not that it detests the upper classes or in any way neglects them, but like our Lord was compassionate to people who were miserable, so the church is compassionate to the miserable and takes up their cause. And this answers Bergoglio. You would think from Bergoglio that the Catholic Church never had any concern for the poor or the miserable. You would think that he was the first person that ever came along that had any care. What is true is that he would like to see a socialist care of the poor and a socialist rise of the poor, and not a Christian care for the poor, a Catholic, based on Catholic principles. And we'll see Leo XIII even talks about that a little bit later too. As if the Catholic Church were never concerned about the poor. It's just not true. The Catholic Church before the 19th century operated all of the alleviation of the poor. It was on a Catholic Church in Europe, and I don't know about England, but certainly in pre-Reformation England, that operated the alleviation of the poor. And there were plenty of poor, before the Industrial Revolution, plenty of poor people, and especially in cities and all, people who were poor even through their own fault. But it was a beautiful system because the church, being local, could know the difference between somebody who was just a lazy bones or someone who really had a problem, like a widow who was striving to raise her family or something. And it didn't come under this enormous state bureaucracy that is centered in some capital far away, and which is the way it is in this country now. Yes. I'm sure the same in England. And then in the 19th century in England, again, particularly, you had the rise of the poorhouses, which were miserable places, but under the tutelage of the state.
Yes, in late, around this time, late 19th century, the whole of the 19th century, really. Yes, the church did do a lot of alleviation of the poor in England, particularly at that time. Obviously, Ireland was also joined to the United Kingdom, and Irish girls who'd made a mistake and whose family had cast her out. A lot of them would come across the water and travel to London. And there was a convent near Paddington that was well known. The nuns would take these girls in and look after them. The church used to do a lot of it. And of course, as the church recedes, the state is more than happy to take its place. So when the church would provide schools and hospitals and almshouses and hospices, all of those traditional roles that the church used to fill at actually a fraction of the cost that what they're filled at now. If the church and the state were in a normal condition, the church would be doing all of those things, or most of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I would certainly rather, have a religious taking care of me than some state employee.
Yeah.
Have to deal with a priest, a brother, or a nun than a state employee. I mean, nothing against state employees. It's just that the care given by someone who is motivated by supernatural charity is always going to be better than the care given by somebody that is motivated either by money, the job, or even by social consciousness, let's say. It's just going to be better. And it was better.
Yes,
because charity wants for the person you're taking care of the same good that you will for yourself. That's the virtue of charity. So that goes a long way.
So I'm going to move on now to paragraph 21, where he's talking about labor and merit and the right use of goods. And the quote that I picked out, you may have another one, my lord, but the one that I spotted was, God has given us this world as a place of exile, and not as our abiding place. As for riches and the other things which men call good and desirable, whether we have them in abundance or are lacking in them, so far as eternal happiness is concerned, it makes no difference. The only important thing is to use them right.
Yes, that's a general theological principle, is that every material or every created thing must be used in the way that God wants us to use them. Every created thing must be loved in the way that God wants us to love them and to the extent that God wants us to love them. That's the general principle. So no created thing is ever sought for itself. It has a use, and we are obliged to use it accordingly. That is, in conformity with the use that God intends for it. And God might intend a different use for the same thing in the hands of different people. And he goes on about, he quotes in paragraph 22, the obligation to give what is above and beyond the needs of your state in life. So that's why God makes the rich, in order that they have a lot and in order that they give away a lot. And sure, they're going to live as rich people in a world of greater luxury than a person who just tills the soil. Certainly, but that pertains to their state. And it is good that they have that leisure and that luxury. We would not have Mozart or Haydn or Handel or any of the other great artists that pack planes from the United States to Europe to see and hear, unless there had been an aristocracy that had plenty of money and plenty of leisure in order to patronize those things. If left to the worker, the lowly worker, he wouldn't have the taste or intelligence to cultivate those things, first of all, and he wouldn't have the money to patronize them. But the glory and beauty of Europe, which is breathtaking, comes from the aristocracy. And people, of course, detest the aristocracy, but they are the ones that whose homes we look at, and the artwork, and it all came from them. Yes. And they do contribute a great deal to society. They don't contribute trucks and cars and things like that, but they contribute much more important things, and that is things that last forever, things that pertain to beauty and to the intellect. And you could not possibly compare any culture on the whole planet to the culture of Europe, and particularly Catholic Europe, which was the result of course, the Catholic faith, the elevation of man's intellect, and also the result of a society in which there was a rich aristocracy. But the aristocracy needs to use their money well and their excess well, and they should give to the poor, they should give to the church. And many of the churches that we see in Europe were put up by the aristocracy. If you take the train into Venice, when you come out of the train station in Venice, there was a church across the street, San Simeone Piccolo, which was erected by a single family in thanksgiving to God for the fact that their son returned unharmed from a war. I mean, that is a testimony, of course, to piety. It still stands, and it is a testimony to their generosity, that they were not attached to their goods, but gave them away for, it's a magnificent church. It's not a big church, but it's a very nice church. That's one family, or the Borgia Chapel, for example, in Santa Maria Maggiore, which is perhaps one of the certainly the most beautiful chapel in all Rome. That's again the effect of an inequality, an aristocracy, and it's an example of rich people doing something intelligent and correct with their money, and also giving to the poor is also part of, and very much part of, what the rich people should do, because they should assign themselves a state of life that is in accordance with reason. They should not be living, in such fabulous luxury that they're spending all of their money on their luxuries. They should live well and enjoy the higher things of life, which gives them the taste for all of these things that we enjoy. But they must be sensitive to the needs of the poor. They must use what God gives them according as God wills that they use it.
On a similar point, I mean, I know you've been to London, my lord, and I know you've been to some of the museums, but this may surprise American listeners, but all of the museums and the art galleries in London, at least the public ones, are free. They are free for anybody to look around. And that was as a result of King George and Queen Victoria. They decided that all the art galleries and all of the museums with all of these treasures in should be free, so that the people from all classes could go in and appreciate the things that there are to see there. And I know that you've been to visit the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, and you said it's a fabulous collection. It's outstanding, but that wouldn't have been free if it hadn't have been for very wealthy patrons, in this case the monarch, saying, well, actually, no, this should be free and in perpetuity.
Yes. The much maligned aristocracy really, as I said, it keeps the airlines in business. Americans go over and soak up Europe far more than the Europeans do themselves. We know where everything is.
That's true.
Because we're starved over here. We have a culture that was essentially Republican and we might say plebeian, not really plebeian, but a culture of the common man and Republican and Protestant. Well, you mix all of those things together and you don't get much out of it as from the point of view of art or architecture. The only kind of decent architecture that in this country was imitation of the Georgian architecture in England. There were some nice buildings like that. One of them, Independence Hall, not to bring up a sore subject, but that was a fine example of Georgian architecture. And the old Philadelphia has some beautiful Georgian architecture in it. But it really, lacking the Catholic faith, there was a lack of interest in higher things, and there was a very strong pursuit of money and what money could buy in this country from the beginning. And that's why it has a sterility about it.
Moving on, because I don't want to make any comment on that. To finish off that paragraph, I'd just like to quote, this is simply Leo XIII summarizing everything we've just said. He says, "Whoever has received from the divine bounty a large share of temporal blessings, whether they be external and material or gifts of the mind, has received them for the purpose of using them for the perfecting of his own nature, and at the same time that he may employ them as the steward of God's providence for the benefit of others."
Mm-hmm. The strong are made to protect the weak. You never get anything from God without some command to use it properly.
We would like to remind you that you are listening to Popes Against the Modern Errors, Rerum Novarum Part 1 on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Matthew Gaskin, and I'm joined by His Lordship Bishop Donald Sanborn of Most Holy Trinity Seminary, Brooksville, Florida. And today we've been discussing Leo XIII's great encyclical, Rerum Novarum, on the use of capital and labour. We want to remind you that this Popes Against the Modern Errors show is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. To obtain permission, please write to mail@truerestoration.org. Moving on to paragraph 24, this is when Pope Leo XIII addresses the real value of life, and that's the moral life. And in paragraph 24 and 25, he talks about the idea that virtue and the moral life are key, and that Christian duties and rights create harmony. Obviously, the corollary of which is that the opposite is true. And he goes on in paragraph 26 to talk about the role of the church. Could you address a few points in these paragraphs?
Yeah, so the church is empowered by God to teach the human race in the name of God and with the power of God and with the infallibility of God. And the church uses bishops and priests to do that, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And a beautiful quote in this paragraph 26, they alone, referring to the priests of the church, can reach the innermost heart and conscience and bring men to act from a motive of duty, to control their passions and appetites, to love God and their fellow men with a love that is outstanding and of the highest degree, and to break down courageously every barrier which blocks the way to virtue, which is really the key. The socialist cannot get down into the heart of man, but the priest can. He does it every Sunday. and he addresses the consciences of men. There is the confessional, that is, that if you violate the law of God, you must come to God in the Holy Sacrament of Penance, declare your sin, and promise never to commit the sin again. That reaches way, way down, keeps men on the straight and narrow. And then there are the sacraments, especially the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, which strengthens people against their passions and which pacifies man inside, so that he listen to the gospel and all of the dictates of the Holy Gospel, that he have a heart softened with regard to material things, that he's not some sort of animal that is searching through the jungle for whatever he can devour, but that that virtue and the state of his soul are the most important things, his eternal salvation, these are the important things, and that material things, yes, they have their use, but they're not so important that we have to get all excited about them. It places them in a, I think that's why, it's one of the reasons why the human race did not change from, say, 1800 BC to 1800 AD in its inventions. There were certainly intelligent people. There were certainly hardworking people. They were not any less intelligent than the people that lived in the 19th century. But I think that the attention of the human race changed violently, almost, we might say, as a result of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and that we saw this turn of humanity away from God and toward the material created world. Therefore, the contraption became more important than the theology. See that having something that would do something for you, some gizmo, as I don't know if you say that in English.
Yes.
Something that would attract our attention and make life a little easier for us, became the object of men's minds. I mean, we see that in Sir Isaac Newton and others, just staring at the world. There's nothing wrong with science. There's nothing wrong with figuring out physical processes and all. But what is wrong is the attention that we give to it. And human beings did not pay too much attention to it. They paid a great deal of attention to God and to religion, philosophy, art, which flows directly from those things. They did not give so much attention, except as the Renaissance and the spirit of the Renaissance matured in the 19th century. You see the attention of great minds upon the things of science, and and the things of money making. I mean, the frenzy of the stock market and the money making, money. That is something that didn't exist before the 19th century. So you see a decline of humanity in that sense, that humanity is totally uncultured now. I mean, anything he's got, he digs up. I mean, the concert hall is full of people like Mozart and Beethoven and Handel. It's not usually if there's a modern composer, it's because the government demands it, or it's some sort of subsidy in order to promote modern music or something. But at least that's true in this country. But what really attracts people is the old culture. This society we live in is incapable of producing that culture because it's addicted to money and what money will buy. So I think that's what he's saying here is that virtue is going to perfect man, and it is the church that is going to give virtue because it has all of the means to do it.
And in paragraph 27, he goes on to talk about the fact that the civil society must go back to Catholic principles, that it was renovated in every part by Christian institutions, and the degeneracy that we see now can't be solved in any other way. No amount of socialism, no amount of Marxism, no amount of capitalism come to that, or distributism will address the key problem, which is the fact that the state is not aligned along Catholic principles.
Yes, that's absolutely true. One of the biggest revolution that ever took place, but it was a very quiet one and a slow one, was the Christianization of society in the Roman Empire, where the gospel completely transformed the way people looked at each other and saw each other. The Roman Empire was 20% free and 80% slave. It was a brutal society. All it knew was might and power and cruelty as virtues. And if you were a slave, you were practically zero. And the gods did not smile on you. That was your lot in life. You were going to have a short life, and we will work you to death. That was the attitude. You were just nothing, and the aristocracy was humanity, essentially. That changed completely with the influx of Catholicism, because the slave was as much a child of God as the aristocrat. And the aristocrat was as much in need of the Holy Eucharist as the slave was. And everyone at the communion rail was quite equal in that sense. Yeah. the king in the Middle Ages kneeling next to the serf. And as the priest holds the Holy Eucharist in front of them, they're both exactly equal in their need for the Savior. They're, no matter what their state in life, their power, and that actually caused a revolution, a society, a social revolution, but a very quiet one, and nothing like what we're used to in recent history, but a total change. Father Cahill is very good on that whole point in his book. I forget the name of his book, but he wrote it. It was an Irish Jesuit. And of the change that came about as a result of the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And that's what prevailed during the Middle Ages, was that the mystical body, the notion of the mystical body, and a true equality in that sense, where we are equal in our dependence upon God, and equal in the fact that we all have the same dependence on the Redeemer for our eternal salvation. It's something like when the Titanic is sinking, everyone has the same dependence on that lifeboat, whether they're the richest people on the boat or the poorest of the steerage class. They all get in the same boat, and that impressed people and really did change society. There was a return to the paganism of old and the cruelty of old as a result of the Renaissance and the Reformation. And we are seeing the the effect of that now and its extreme effect right now.
Pope Leo then goes on to talk about the church's work amongst the poor and charity. For the benefit of the listeners who may be reading through this, going through paragraphs 29 through to 31. And in these three paragraphs, he talks particularly about the church's work amongst the poor, which is clearly something the church never did before, until after Vatican II. And then he talks about the necessity of charity and the church and state working together, which, again, some people might find a bit shocking, but it is generally accepted that that's a good thing in a Catholic society. Although we've been more or less trained to believe that that's a bad thing now, and people who live in Western liberal democracies cannot possibly understand that actually the church and state should work together. That's the normal way that things should be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a heresy, actually, that has embraced, that human beings have embraced, as a result, again, of the French Revolution, which is the source of all of our problems. All of our social and political problems, and we might even say economic, but social and political theory comes out of that awful revolution. But a pre-intonation of that awful revolution was the American Revolution. It was not quite as radical, we might say, but it had all of the elements of the French Revolution in it. And I know a lot of Americans don't like to hear that, but it is nonetheless true. And it was the first society that was created without God, and the Constitution makes no mention of God. That was the first in the history of the world, a society created without any reference to religion. So that has become the mainstay of the world. As a matter of fact, the Europeans during the 19th century looked to the United States for inspiration. Look how wonderful things are in the United States, a free church in a free state, and we should separate church and state in the European countries because it's just life is so wonderful over there. Now, it was especially said on the continent. And life is not so wonderful because, well, this week, with the Supreme Court judgment, you cannot cite the law of God against what is unnatural. So, as I pointed out in my recent newsletter, once you bless the unnatural as something that is legal and right and the object of right and civil right. Well, as I said, go to Wikipedia and look under the list of paraphilias, and you'll find 102 paraphilias. That is, attractions to various things that are so bizarre and unmentionable here, but which nevertheless would, according to all the logic, be the object of civil right and legal right. So if you separate church from state and state from church, you the ship of state goes off without rudder and without sails. And you have people deciding social or moral issues, let's say beyond social, moral issues, who know nothing about morality, who have absolutely no compass at all. I mean, it's just a ship riding with the waves and being tossed by currents. And it means the ultimate destruction of society. It'll take decades and maybe even more than a century, but any society that is operating on that principle will eventually crash and sink, just as a ship will if it has no rudder, has no sails, and has no compass. So, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that separation of church and state is just a meme that Protestants use to destroy the influence of the church anyway, because in England, the state and the church is very clearly united. The head of state is also the head of the church. And you don't hear anybody but the most hardcore and ardent atheists complain about that.
No, but separation of church and state actually was not called for by Protestants, but by deists and Enlightenment philosophers. believe it or not, the Protestants in this country were appalled by separation of church and state in the Constitution and accused Jefferson of being an atheist for asking for it. He said that there should be a wall of separation between the church and the state. That's Jefferson. And the Protestants, the Anglicans and other Protestants, accused them of being an atheist for advocating such a thing. So it really comes from that 18th century deism, and there was plenty of that in England, and plenty of that in France and Holland and every place else. But it comes from that, the idea of a secular society, a secularistic society, a lay society that has no regard for God or religion at all. Even England, where there is a technical union of church and state, the deism has been so triumphant in that country that you know the influence of the church is virtually nil.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The Episcopalians in this country voted overwhelmingly. It's something like 100 and something to 29 in their Congress or whatever they have out in Salt Lake City. In favor of doing same-sex marriages in their churches. Now, they are in the Anglican Communion, the Episcopalians, the mainstream Episcopalians. So they're going to marry man and man and woman in their churches. This is the effect of deism, essentially, that affected all religions except the Catholic religion, and except certain Protestant reactions to it. But it is the effect of the 18th century thinking, the separation of church and state, which was given flesh in the French Revolution.
And these are the people that say that you should pick up your Bible, yet they can't open up their own Bibles and figure out that those unnatural vices are wrong.
Yes, I mean, it's so clearly contrary to sacred scripture. If your religion is based on scripture alone, if the Bible is your book, now come on, St. Paul is so explicit about it. He excoriates the Corinthians over it, the Romans, and there was plenty of it in both Corinth and Rome. Excoriates them. And the Old Testament is full of it says it's an abomination that man should lie with man and so forth. It's so explicit. It means that they are abandoning their very basic beliefs, and that it has become essentially a deistic religion. That's what it is mostly in this country. It's as Father Cicada says, great music and no confession. That's the Episcopalian Church in this country. They usually have magnificent English-style churches, beautiful churches, and they wear vestments, and everything is beautiful.
Yeah,
it's the great place to have your daughter married, you know. And the minister is very nice and will never preach anything to you that will disturb you in any way. And will happily come over to dinner if you invite him. It's that sort of religion, and so I'm guessing that it's a little similar in your country too. But
absolutely, yes, definitely. The local vicar is a lovely man or lady, as the case may be now, and you'll never hear anything bad. And actually, I must admit, the Anglicans, they do sing well. I don't know if you hear it in the States, but every Christmas, I'm sure you must do. Every Christmas, I do listen to King's College, Cambridge.
Oh, wonderful.
The carol service is fantastic.
Yes, you can't beat the British for choral music. I mean, that's well known. England takes it in choruses and choral music, and no other nationality even comes close to them. So yes, we were all addicted to English Christmas music over here too. Now they do the best job. There's no doubt about it.
So having talked about all that immorality before, not the music, the stuff we were talking about before.
Yes.
It just moves us on nicely to talking about the purpose of the state. And the Pope clearly states that there are really 6 areas in which the state should take center stage, and that is to, first of all, for a moral rule to make sure that morals are upheld, a well-regulated family life, respect for religion and justice, meaning the true religion, moderation and fair imposing of public taxes, progress of arts and trade, and the abundant yield of the land through everything which makes citizens better and happier.
Yes, another magnificent quote. And in this, all modern governments fall flat on their faces on all 6 counts.
Yes, everything. There's nothing.
I mean,
there's nothing there that you could say they do well.
The opposite. They pervert moral life. They pervert the family. They have no respect for religion or justice. The taxes are horrendous and a terrible burden, worse than the burden of the aristocrat upon the serf in the Middle Ages. Progress of art and trade, usually enacting laws that in some way prohibit or inhibit all of those things, and abundant yield of the land through everything. In fact, so usually through socialistic programs that they in some way or the other mess up both trade and agriculture. At least I would say that for this country.
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same for us. I'm sure you're not familiar with the wonders of the European Common Agricultural Policy that pays farmers to not farm. That's something that we have over here, which is marvelous. We love it.
Oh, that was cooked up by Roosevelt in this country.
Oh, really?
Yes. Paying farmers not to farm, yes.
Yeah, those lovely bureaucrat chaps in Brussels, they make sure that we do that as well. It's brilliant. It's a really good system. I'm being sarcastic, of course. Moving on again, and to paragraph 33 now. He talks about the idea of justice and that all are equal in rights regarding the state. Now, this is pretty topical for a lot of people because you mentioned Wall Street and the City of London and really any other centre of banking around the world. You've got a lot of enormous banks that when they commit huge amounts of fraud and make enormous losses, they then expect to be bailed out. And when it turns out that these people have been committing crime, the Attorney General comes out and says about, actually it was a British bank, it was HSBC. I've followed this financial news. I think it was Eric Holder. He turned around and said, we can't prosecute these people because the words used was they present a systemic risk to the financial system. But basically what it means is that they're too big to jail. They're too big to fail, so we have to bail them out. And then they're too big to jail, so we can't prosecute them. And in the state we have now, there is, we talk about the state should uphold a moral rule. It seemed, and you said this state does not uphold a moral rule. In fact, it encourages quite the opposite. I'm purely talking in terms of finance and economics, but this idea that there should be justice for all equally in rights regarding the state seems to have fallen apart.
Oh, absolutely, yes. As I said, there is an aristocracy, and they have their own laws. And the aristocracy is an aristocracy of money, and I think that's probably true of Europe, as much true of Europe as it is here. We saw that in 2008, where certain large entities in New York were too big to go under, and then there was Government Motors. I'm referring to General Motors. That's what they called it. Even Obama referred to it as that. That had to be bailed out because they were too big to go under. And yes, it's socialism. It's the blundering or downright dishonesty of the banks or of large corporations is ignored. The money that is garnered by hardworking people is spent on in order to make up for their problems. Yes, equal justice under law is everyone must conform to the law and should be punished accordingly. That is certainly a tenet of good government. It doesn't exclude what we call privilege, which means a private law. In other words, you must conform to the law that is made for you. So, for example, the aristocracy had certain privileges. There was nothing contrary to the state in regard to that. But nevertheless, everyone must conform to the law. If the law does not prosecute, if the law does not pursue equally those who violate its tenets, you have the beginning of chaos and also the beginning of revolution. What makes people rise up and revolt is a cynicism and a failure to believe in their government as something that is seeing to their welfare. So you're really playing with fire. That's what he says. Society, no matter what changes, he says in 34, may occur in forms of government, there will ever be differences and equalities of condition in the state. Society cannot exist or be conceived of without them. And then there he's saying there's a certain inequality among members of the state. But the law is the law, and rule of law, that is what makes the strength of a nation. And when that breaks down, you're really drilling at the foundations of the whole thing.
I think we're going to have to cut it off there for this episode. But for now, may I thank you, my Lord, for being my guest today. And may I again wish you good health and continued success in the work you do at the Seminary in Florida and your apostolic work around the world.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. If you have any questions for His Lordship or feedback on this episode, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us at modernerrors@truerestoration.org, and we will pass along your questions or comments. We would also take this moment to remind you that all correspondence with us is strictly confidential. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you have found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, that you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I am Matthew Gaskin. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.